All right, so after talking a little bit about court rules, I want to speak a little bit about motions and different types of motions, basic things you want to be thinking about, and then how to find forms so that when you do decide to file a motion, you're not necessarily starting from scratch. So, in the realm of criminal law, I'm just going to sort of keep the visual on this Mass Trial Court Law Libraries page. I'll show you something on this in a sec, but just as some setup, in the world of criminal law, there are three sort of basic categories of motions that are really important to keep in mind. The first and the most basic are motions to dismiss, which are relatively simple. We're not going to spend much time on that. The next two categories are motions to suppress, which are probably the most familiar type to you guys. These are constitutionally based motions, right? That pursuant to the typically going to be the 4th, 5th, and 6th Amendments of the federal Constitution, that evidence should be suppressed either as violating, say, the 4th Amendment requirement for a search warrant, or the constitutional requirement against being forced to incriminate oneself, and so on. So that's sort of the basic world of motions to suppress. So those are constitutionally based motions. The other biggies, which may not be as familiar in name, are called motions in limine. And those are evidentiary-based motions. So an example of that, and we'll look at a couple of forms for one of these in a few minutes, is, say, a motion to exclude evidence of a prior bad act. Right? You're a defense attorney. You get the sense that the prosecution is going to try to introduce evidence maybe of the defendant's prior record or something they did in the past, and you want to file a motion in limine and ask the judge to prevent the prosecution from ever introducing that. Right? The idea is to get that settled before it comes up at trial and the jury hears the argument, and so on and so forth. Okay, so those are the big categories: motions to suppress and motions in limine. Right. The other big thing to keep in mind is that in addition to sort of the raw form of a motion, and I'll sort of show you what I'm talking about when I say that in a moment, keep in mind that sometimes there are particular things you have to file with the motion, and those are going to be dictated by statute or by court rule. Sometimes you'll have to file a memorandum of law, oftentimes an affidavit to support what the motion says, and so on. So that's where it's important to be familiar with navigating procedural statutes and court rules so that you're aware of what needs to be filed with the motions, and also so you're aware of the time frame. When do these need to be filed? How long does the other side have to respond, and so forth. Okay. So the basic point of this video is to get you into finding forms, and I just wanted to show a free resource really quickly. We've looked at this before for court rules, but this is the website for the Massachusetts Trial Court Law Libraries. Again, one that I would recommend you bookmarking. So before we went down and went into court rules, I just wanted to show you really quickly an example of some free forms you can find. Probably not the most useful, but just so that you can know these are out there. A link to forms. Again, keep these in mind in case you don't necessarily wind up practicing in the world of criminal law, because there are lots of other ones out here that are potentially helpful. But you have a crime, criminal procedure, criminal records, domestic violence, so on, several categories that might be helpful. So I'm just going to click into the crime. We'll look at crime and criminal procedure. You'll see for crime certain types of reporting forms. Criminal procedure, if you're a defense attorney, this is a certificate for district court that you've complied with your discovery obligations. Some different types of discovery forms over here. I just wanted to pull this up. This is a pretty typical template type motion. This is a general purpose criminal motion for use in Massachusetts District Court. You'll see it's sort of a fill in the blank type thing where you say, imagine this is probably most useful for a pro se defendant, or if you're really helping somebody out on a pro bono basis. Something like this can be a cheap, sort of easy way. If you want to ask for a continuance, remove a default, so on and so forth. And you'll see at the bottom, this is where you have to include anything that's required to go along with the motion. So it's a pretty basic free form, but just so you can get a sense of what one type would look like. So from the realm of free sources, I just want to move quickly and talk a little bit about how you could find forms on Lexis and Westlaw. And we're going to start with Lexis Advance. And you'll see that I've already sort of set up a search here. A couple of tactics you can take, as always, on Lexis and West. One is to run a search. And then in Advance and Next, you're going to rely on your filters to get down to what you need, or you can always browse sources. So I just wanted to try one with a search first. Just typed in motion to suppress evidence that was seized pursuant to a warrantless search. So I just put in some of the main search terms. Lots of different types of motions to suppress, right? So if you just type into motion to suppress, you get a lot of results. Good to narrow it down. And actually, this is probably still too broad, but just to give you guys a sense of the hits that you get. So under the category, clearly I put it on forms, right? Massachusetts, and you'll notice that I also included non-jurisdictional sources. So these are the national sources that I've talked about. On Westlaw, this would be things like AmJur, pleading and practice forms. Lexis has their own equivalents. You can sort of see in the background, this is their form books. So this is useful just in case the jurisdiction you're interested in doesn't have anything specific. You could still get some forms that are probably pretty adaptable. So that's why I did that, and then I limited to criminal law and procedure. So ran this search, got 195 results. You'll see that only one of them is from Massachusetts, and if you go and click on it, you'll notice that it isn't actually a motion to suppress, it's a motion in limine. So another sort of quirk with the Lexis Advanced Search Engine. I've said before, I'm not entirely sure what's going on with that, and in fact it still comes up if you add quotation marks around these and run an and search. Motion to suppress is a phrase and warrantless search is a phrase. So something a little funky going on. So I tend to like to default to a natural language search because I think that means you're at least picking up more and not eliminating potentially useful options. So I'm going to go ahead and X back out and clear out the Massachusetts ones, so we have the non-jurisdictional ones as well. So different sample motions to suppress, just so you can see one. I'm going to go into this motion to suppress items seized during a search incident to an arrest. Okay, so that would be one where a warrant is probably an exception to the warrant requirement as long as the arrest was lawful, and you get a sense of the form that you can use. Right, and this is nice. You could download the form and edit it. So you can get a sense of what this looks like. This actually has some discussion of the big case law. And then the language at the end. So you probably have to modify a lot of this for your jurisdiction, and always be aware of underlying law that's cited. You want to go look at it and check and make sure that the case law that the form is using does in fact support your position, that it's still good law. Of course, be aware of any relevant case law from your own jurisdiction. This is clearly a form for a federal case, right? The USA v. the defendant. And again, this is sort of the basic form of the motion, but you might be required to file a memorandum of law along with it and an affidavit. So think of forms as sort of a starting place, and not an end unto themselves, sort of like any other type of secondary source, right? You're using it to get going. You're using someone else's expertise to point you in the right direction, but you've still got to do some legwork on your own. So that's running a search in the forms and sort of going through. The other option, like I said, is to browse sources. And just keep in mind, when you're searching something like forms, you are not necessarily picking up helpful secondary sources that might have forms embedded within them, and an example of that is the MCLE publications. You'll notice that we didn't get any hits for under Massachusetts. The only one we got was that weird motion in limine one. There were no results from MCLE, so that form limiter isn't picking those up, so just sort of be aware of that. If we wanted to look at Massachusetts sources, can be a good way to sort of see if embedded within those sources could be something helpful. I'm just going to search for the word criminal within Massachusetts and secondary materials, and you'll notice well, A, that Lexis Advanced did something weird and sort of limited my search in a weird way. Let me try that one more time. Filter back to Mass. And you'll notice some MCLEs that we've looked at in class. Right, so I searched for criminal and then I limited to Massachusetts over here. So if you were in Superior Court, right, here's some criminal practice forms. Could view the table of contents, see if you could find things that you need. Okay, a lot of this stuff, again, we've talked about discovery practice. You could find some helpful discovery motions, pretrial matters, motions, motions to dismiss, motions to suppress, and you'll notice the suppress evidence is sort of differentiated from suppressing statements and identifications. But if you keep drilling down, you'll see all sorts of samples, right? And these are going to be, would be a basic motion. This is the memorandum, right, that would need to be submitted with it, actually with the points of law being discussed, affidavits. So this can actually be really, really useful. You get forms for not just the motion itself, but for the actual memorandum of law where you discuss the basis for your argument. To dismiss or to support or to suppress evidence or so on, right? And then you also get these helpful checklists that can give you information on what to think about, right? What to ask your client about, what to think about in terms of your resource, in terms of your research and so on. Okay, so just important to think about browsing these individual sources as well, in addition to running searches in the forms databases. Okay. So that's Lexis Advance. I'm going to show you Westlaw really quickly. A couple of different tactics you can take. One is, again, go look at individual materials for a state. So for Mass, you might want to look at Mass practice and see if there are volumes that could contain forms. Again, keep in mind if you practice in other areas, lots of other volumes, right, that include forms. Here's a family law one. This legal forms is one full volume full of legal forms. Those are actually all civil. Motor vehicle law and practice with forms, procedural forms, these are all civil as well. So for you crim practitioners, you know, consider looking in the crim practice and procedure volume. Not as many forms in there as you would hope, but a couple other ones I wanted to point out. This drunk driving defense volume has motions relevant to a defense attorney defending someone accused of committing an OUI. Right, lots of samples. Pretrial motion samples, sample motions to dismiss, memos, and so on. Just don't forget about these. Okay, a motions in limine volume, right? So those would be the motions to suppress evidence based on, you know, evidentiary requirements, so on. Okay, and then you also have on Westlaw Next and Westlaw Classic, you have the MCLEs as well. And just keep in mind that I told you those are a little more browsable in print and on Lexis, because on Westlaw you actually just have to run a search once you get in. So if we wanted to look at the, say, the District Court Criminal Defense Manual, which you guys looked at in class and has a substantive motions practice chapter, you'd have to actually run a search, so you can't browse. That's a little bit annoying. So just keep that in mind. Just to show you an example of another jurisdiction, lots of jurisdictions have different resources you can use. For California, notice there is a forms heading. These all look pretty civil based, right? So these are specific forms resources. But again, what I'm telling you to keep in mind is that sort of general secondary sources can also include forms. This is one just to take a look at if you're interested in practicing in California. California criminal practice motions, jury instructions, and sentencing. So at this point, you'd want to go look at the different types of motions that you can file. Okay. And last but not least, on Westlaw, and I'll show you how to do this on Westlaw Classic as well, there's a big forms heading, right? Like right from the main page. So if you didn't have a particular source in mind, you wanted to run a general search just to look for forms, you'd click on forms and you find yourself in this form finder tool where you can choose a jurisdiction, a topic, These are sort of the general forms publications that are available on West. Okay, so imagine we're looking for a Massachusetts motion. Okay, I'm going to do a motion in limine, right? Well, let's imagine that we want to find a motion to exclude evidence of a prior bad act. This is an example that I mentioned earlier. I think the most relevant heading here is litigation, criminal procedure. And let's just run a search. You could run it up in the main search bar without using anything advanced, or you could search particular fields. I think a general search is probably best. So let's do motion to exclude evidence prior bad acts. You could put motion in limine in there too. That wouldn't hurt anything. Okay. And you'll notice, right, we get 2,411 results. And even though we chose Massachusetts initially, right, you'll see that you get some federal options and some national options. I tend to think it's useful just to filter from the beginning and look at the Mass ones, because if you can find a jurisdiction-specific example, all the better. Okay. So just as an example, maybe you have an indication that the other side's wanting to introduce prior convictions for operating under the influence. Right? This one looks like it might be helpful. You get a form for the motion. This one's pretty sparse, as you can imagine. Easy edit. You could go in and edit it. Okay. You can go in and look at other ones. Some of them will be a little bit more in depth than that. Right. And just sort of keep in mind sort of the underlying issue that you're interested in, depending on what the prosecution in this instance would be looking to introduce. Okay, and some of them will be, like I said, a more sparse motion. Some of them will actually be a memorandum. I'm not sure if there's a memorandum in here, but you could add that in if you're actually interested in getting a form for the underlying law and not just one for the very sparse text of the motion. Okay, so here's an example of something from a general national source, American jurisprudence. Say you weren't really finding anything Massachusetts that looked very helpful. You might sort of go into the national forms sources and look and see if there's anything that looks more useful. Right? And you can get some legal arguments, practice notes that tell you things to keep in mind. This one actually has a note that mentions that this was a successful argument in Massachusetts Superior Court. And again, you have this easy edit button. Okay. On Westlaw Classic, just in case that's what you wind up with, there's a form finder button up top, right? And it works very similarly. Okay, so just something to play around with. All right, so that's sort of a basic intro to the types of motions you might encounter and how to get started and finding some templates to get you started. Just like I said, important to keep in mind is if you find a really good form, again, particularly with the memorandums of law where the law itself starts to get fleshed out, you want to go and check the underlying sources and make sure that the cases that the form includes say what the form or the person who wrote the form indicates that they say, and then search for more particular law in your jurisdiction. All right, so with that, as always, give me a shout if you have any questions.